Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, welcome to the 13th. Yeah, in fact, it's our 13th event of our series Data Heroes. And today I'm very pleased to announce that we have Jonathan Sunderland with us. My name is Gero Presser. I'm from Queenscape and very happy to guide you through our questions today. And Jonathan is a data leader with over 30 years of experience at various companies. And currently, he's working as a data evangelist for our partner, Ab Initio Software. And today, we want to learn from his experience, take away recommendations, and discuss how he sees the future of the whole data space. Yeah, Jonathan, I think it would be great when you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Jonathan Sunderland. As Gero said, I've been working, or I guess been paid to work in data for about 30 years. I was just thinking my first job was working in a computer shop when I was about 13. So, oh goodness me, it's actually 40 years that I could actually say I've been paid, although a lot of that time I was in at school or college. Yeah, I've done lots of interesting things over the years. Worked for large companies and small companies, at startups. I've worked in the video game industry. I've worked for insurance. I've been architect and engineer. I was director of data science at a couple of organisations. So lots and lots of diverse areas. One of my real passions is two key areas. One is around organizational agility, right, and really being able to adapt and survive and thrive and grow, and helping organizations do that. And there's a lot of challenges around culture, which we'll talk about. And the other area really is around leaving legacies, helping the next generation and helping others come through. And I feel really proud of the organisations that I've worked with and how I've left them. And I guess the other areas that I'm just insanely curious, right? I just want to understand the world. I'm on this, I guess, fruitless task of trying to describe, to sum up life and our purpose and everything we do in a simple equation. And I don't know whether that's ever possible. So I'm always trying to understand the world and what we can do to make it better. And of course, being good with data is a key part of that. Yeah, that's kind of me in a bit. We'll probably dive into some of those areas, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a very exciting biography, and getting better with data, I think, is the main focus of our series. So we are interested what you actually have learned in your past in these various companies, and I think something that is quite interesting because it's a very famous brand. You mentioned video gaming. I think you worked at Sony PlayStation.
Yep.
And maybe you can talk about your experiences there. How is this company or this group using data? What did you learn there? That's definitely interesting for us.
Well, obviously, without being too giving away too much commercially sensitive information, but I think I joined at a point when Sony was going through an interesting phase, right? They'd gone from making physical consoles and selling, what was originally CDs and then DVDs, Blu-rays, to being a networked company where you had people online playing each other, right? The late 2000s, early 2010s was a kind of an interesting transition for video games, right? It went from people being solitary playing or playing with their friends on the couch to playing online, right? Competitive games. And one of the interesting things about that is how do you build a community on there? How do you understand the way that people play, right? And understand what's valuable to them and what's interesting, and how do you drive that engagement, from a fundamental thing of any business, right? You want to increase the value, and you do that by selling more products and cutting your costs. You've got to get things wrong. And one of the interesting things about Sony is, it's insanely creative, right? They had an in-house team developing video games as well as supporting a rich network of developers and publishers. And so having information, understanding what was working and what wasn't working was really important. And we were at the heart of that, which was really fascinating. So I was responsible for, or part of a team responsible for building and implementing data processing to capture data from the various servers and services, to try and get an understanding of what people were doing. One of the cool things about it was, I had, I used my own console, or we had console on a desk, and I could play games, and I could try and get an understanding of that. I mean, that was a really important thing for me. I wasn't going to wait for a specification, someone to do some business analysis. I was like, I'm going to play a game, I'm going to generate some data, or see if I can generate data and see if I can understand that, and then look at what the server logs were telling me against what I thought I was doing, so that I then had that ground foundation in truth. I thought, one of the things that's always been important to me is, when I work in an industry, it's got to be something that I relate to. So I've always had a passion for engineering and cars. I started out, one of my early jobs was working at a company that was supporting marketing services for cars, and so I was able to apply that knowledge, right? Avidly reading magazines and understanding anything about car makes and models and using that. And similarly with video games, I've always liked playing video games. There's an affinity with doing that. So it wasn't just, oh, we're going to create a data team, let's get some business analysts and some designers and some engineers, and let's build a data warehouse and do something. It was, there was an intrinsic need for myself to understand, do I understand what I'm doing? Can I represent that? And that moved on from just doing kind of business intelligence activities of reporting what was going on to driving things that made a difference. And some of those things included like building a recommendation engine for the store and other such stuff. And that was really rewarding, because then you're moving from just reporting what's happening to try and influence, and give people a better experience. Because ultimately, if data's not changing behavior, then it's not valuable, right? And if you think about the very, very simplest form, that you've got behavior and data, right? And those two things are kind of linked, and behavior creates data and data changes behavior, right? And there's other chains in those links, but ultimately you've got those two aspects. And the closer they can become coupled and the more interactive they can be, the more value you're going to drive from that. And my experience is that many organizations miss that subtlety, or they overbalance one way. So they spend far too much effort discerning data from behavior and not enough in driving it back the other way, right? Or more time, in dealing with certain aspects of that. So, that was really good. We started out, there was a handful of people in the team. We grew to be quite a large department. I was very fortunate to travel to visit my colleagues in the US and in Japan, and learn and build out relationships there to understand what data, how people can use. And effectively we had a very big market in the US and a lot of the engineering work done in Japan. So there was trying to understand and build those relationships. So it wasn't just a matter of I was trying to think about the right way of describing this. Some people working in a data team will be just waiting for a set of requirements to come in from a business leader, right? And I'm never satisfied by that. I want to go out and do those things myself. And so that creates some interesting tensions, but also it was quite rewarding in the end, if that helps.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think now is an interesting point for a chance for the next question, because I think after that you worked for an insurance company, and somehow this feels like a complete change of culture, probably. And if you think about this data behavior, I can fully understand this for gaming, but is it the same for insurances? So,
well, yeah.
What did you learn there?
So that's a really interesting thing. So I've been at Sony for about 6 years. First 3 years were building out the data processing, business intelligence capability, and helping lay the groundwork for that and doing lots of work. I mean, I can't take all responsibility. There's a great team there and lots of people doing amazing work, and many of them are still there. I did help set up the data science function, and having been through kind of the transition of one console generation to another, went from PS3 to PS4 launch and the post PS4 launch, I kind of felt that there was time for me to move on. Right, I created a team that didn't need me, and that was a difficult but also a really rewarding thing, because it meant that I could go and do other things. And I think, in life, that's a really important thing, is that if you can make yourself redundant, then you can start to take control of your own destiny. That's a broader philosophical thing. So I kind of started looking, and then this insurance company said, "Oh, we're setting up we're trying to be better with data. We've got a whole transformation program. We want a data scientist to lead some of the aspects of that." And I was like, "Well, I'm not sure I want to do that." But we end up having lots of conversations, and it was an interesting thing, right? Because it's completely orthogonal. Yeah. Video games, I literally, I had a console on my desk. I could do things. I could look across and I could see the data, right? It was almost instantaneous, my understanding. Yet insurance is not like that at all. It's not that it shouldn't be, but it wasn't like that. And the other thing I realized is that this was going to be a really fantastic opportunity for me to learn and to test myself in ways that hadn't been tested before, right? I'd spent probably 30 years doing very technical things, right? Being a coder and a developer and an engineer and an architect and designing data systems and doing analytics. But I'd never really had to effectively lead a business capability from scratch. And so it was literally a blank sheet of paper. I had no team, I had no budget, I had no data, I had no technology. I didn't know the organization, I didn't know the people. It was, I end up spending between 3 and 5 hours a day commuting, getting up at 5 in the morning every day for 3 years to get to work. After I landed, I realized that it was going to be, significant cultural differences, right? That I was used to. The things that I'd taken for granted were, if I wanted to get something done at Sony, I could just walk upstairs and talk to the systems engineers and talk about, getting some new disk provisioned or a new server, and we would have a conversation to that. It wasn't like that at all. The large insurance company was, oh, we've got the supplier and we've got an SLA and it's going to take X number of days or weeks, and it was just fundamentally every area was different. And so that was an interesting thing of the company wanted me because of my drive, my experience, and my kind of passion for agile and ability to do things with data and to fundamentally change them. And yet, there was also this collective resistance because people didn't want to do that. So, that was a really interesting set of challenges. So, even now, every time I think about it, I think it's utter madness, right? The situation of, but the thing was that got me is that insurance is all about data. It always has been, right? It's statistics. It's what is the risk of this thing happening? Let's combine those risks, the peril and severity, combine those together to understand maybe a basic price, and understand the marketing aspect, understand our current exposure, and whether we should be selling insurance to this person, whether selling motor insurance to this person right now changes our risk portfolio. Because this is the thing, you don't know, right, when you sell an insurance product, how much it's going to cost you. This is the really interesting thing. It's a price, right? Gero, I'm going to sell you insurance for your BMW and it's going to be €700 this year. Well, is that the right price? Is it not the right price? Will we make a profit on that? I don't know, right? So part of that thing is an element of, well, there's guessing, but there's also a way of managing and mitigating risks with that. But also, you just use lots of statistics on the data. So it's all about data. It's all about data as providing as much richness to that as possible. And so that's really what appealed to me, is driving that agility and the thought of actually being able to provide and change the business from that. I mean, there's a lot of hubris, right? You think, am I going to be able to change the world? Yes, of course I can. And then you realize that your ego is completely flawed. But that's when you learn lots. But I established a team, right? We built a team from scratch. And after, again, my mission was to build a team that doesn't need me, and being really open about that, right? Because that means I can go work on the next thing. I know it's maybe a very selfish thing, but it's also a great thing, because you're building capability and building opportunity for others to come through. And that's a really important thing for me. And if I look now, there's a complete new brand that the Direct Line Group have got, called Darwin Insurance, and that was built on the foundations of the data science team that I created to do alternate pricing. So, that's a really profound thing.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. So obviously, you succeeded in making the team successful, and you moved on. And I think you ended up, and this probably was the next position, I think, at Ab Initio.
Well, not quite, right?
Not quite. Okay.
I spent about 18 months at a little startup called Harbour and that's a really interesting idea, right? It's building a data marketplace, the ability where you can publish data and other people can subscribe to it and consume that data. And it wasn't without challenges, because most of it is built upon the idea that it's, putting their data in the cloud. And gosh, even 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, that was still deemed as a kind of risky thing for many large enterprises. If you think about the basics of analytics, right? What is analytics from first principles? Is actually providing context. Something has happened, right? A customer's bought a product, a customer has churned, the car accident happened, someone played this video game. Analytics are all about context. What was happening leading up to that event? What was going on with that person, with the world, with everything else around that? And what you're trying to understand is, if I see a large number or a significant number of similar events happening, what are the consistent patterns that lead up to that, right? So analytics is all about context and bringing context together, and that means having diverse and orthogonal data, right? You don't want to have data that you want to have some data that reinforces what you know, but what you're really understanding, what was the weather like? What was what advertising had a customer seen? What have they had? What coffee had they had for breakfast? Or all kinds of what are the data points that tell you something that's useful, then allow you to say, if I see a similar pattern of events, does this mean that this customer is going to do this thing, and therefore what intervention should I take? Because it might be that if you realize that, for example, a customer is going to churn, you want to identify that before they happen and maybe offer them a better product, or understand what it is that's causing them to not want your service anymore. So what does that fit in with what we were just talking about? Well, I need to be able to get a hold of that data, right? If I'm doing analytics, as a data scientist, I'm insanely curious. I'm kind of needy of data. I want things that are going to give me context, whether it's internal or external. I need that information. So having a platform, having the ability to find and easily bring that data in is really important. And actually there's the interesting thing of why would Gero give me his data, and why would I give my data to Gero? We're different organizations. Where's that trust come from? How do we enable that to work? If I give you access to that data, how do I know you're going to use it for that purpose only? So there's a lot of issues that are actually cultural around, who owns the data, what you can do with it, where it can go. If it's going to be valuable, you've got to bring it into context of other things. But you don't, but there's the paradox with data is that if you don't know the value of data to somebody else until they use it to identify what it's going to do. And so, many organizations, they are the custodians of data, right? As particularly as platforms where social media platforms where people do things, they interact with, tweets or posts or whatever, and they like particular products or videos, and that creates patterns of behavior that are potentially monetizable, right? And whether that is a good or a bad thing, I don't want to get into that debate. But the thing is that data, right? Those platforms are custodians of customers' data. I think it would be great if we as individuals have an understanding of the value we bring to other organizations in our data, and that we were recompensed for that. So you need to have full chain, full lineage to understand that. And so there's an element of, I think, we need more, and maybe this is a thing that's going to emerge out, kind of a visionary thing, is the ability to do escrow analytics, right? The ability for me to provide data for you to use, and for you to use it, and for both of us to understand the value of that data and say, okay, you now know the value of that data, I know the value of that data, you can't extract that value without me agreeing to it. And it may be me as a representative of all of my customers that have done something, so that I can say, hey, I'm going to give each of my customers this small amount because I know that Gero can use that data in that way. So I think that what we should see, if data is going to be more connected, if we see legislation to drive that what we're going to see is more escrow analytics, right? I think it's the only way it could work, where I can bring, and that's ultimately that's about trust.
Yeah.
So this is the great thing with me. You're never going to get a short answer. So yes, before I joined Ab Initio, I worked for a little startup. Yes, I joined Ab Initio a couple of years ago.
This was basically my question. It was fascinating to learn about this escrow analytics, but I think it's a topic of its own. I think there's so much research and things going on around it. So maybe we can really continue now with Ab Initio.
Yes.
I was curious, why did you join Ab Initio? What's your role there? What is a data evangelist, and what's your personal motivation for doing this?
So I've known Ab Initio for 20 odd years, since early 2001 or whatever. I used them at a small company called Clarity Blue, which became part of Experian. I used Ab Initio to help me build platforms. I used, when I set up the team at Sony. Of course, that's one of the tools I used, and again at other organisations that I've been at. One of the things, so Ab Initio means doing things from first principles, right? It's I think an unusual thing that not many companies can have. The name of their company is also their strategy, right? And I'm trying to think of many others, but there's millions of companies, so that research will be an interesting. I mean, there's a great bit of data analytics you could do. What are the list of all the companies, and how many of them actually have their strategy as their company name? Anyway, the thing that I've always liked about Ab Initio is that it gives me capacity. Both as a business and as an individual, right? Capacity to go and do other things, right? And that's a really, really important thing. If you want to be creative, then you've got to stop what you're doing and do something else, whatever it is, right? Whatever it is, wherever you're doing, if you want to be creative and create new value, you've got to stop. And that means, which is a weird thing, I need to create something, and then that needs to flourish and grow into something of value and scale, right? Scaling is really the challenge. I need to scale out this idea and implement it. And what Ab Initio gave me is the ability to do that and not worry about it, right? To sleep at night and to just automatically implement stuff. I built data processing frameworks way back. I learned C and Unix in the early 90s. I wrote applications for doing data processing from scratch. So I had a good understanding of writing code and implementing business logic. But most of the time is doing the boring stuff, right? It's managing files, handling processing, dealing with logs. Thinking about, well, I've designed something, and then 6 weeks later you get an exception to that processing, and then you have to do it. If you think about that first principles, if data is useful, it's going to change behavior, right? So we build a platform, customers use it, we kind of do something to change their behavior, they do something more. Let's say that your objective is to keep your to reduce churn, right? Which is, you're on a platform and you want to use data to reduce churn. Well, that's great, but what that actually means is now you've got more users being more active, generating more data. So now it becomes harder to understand what customers are doing because you've now got more data to deal with, right? And you've got more people doing it. So you've now got more diverse patterns of behavior you need to understand. So the very act of using data makes data worthless, which is a paradox. It's just like getting into a swimming pool and trying to run, right? It's very easy when the water's only like a few centimeters deep, but by the time it gets up to your waist or even up to your chest, it's really hard, right? And you've kind of, the act of moving your hands quickly creates that drag. Maybe there's something that, some physics parable there about the cube of the velocity or something. So what I immediately got with Ab Initio is that it just took away that burden, right? It's effectively there's two parts to it. One is an execution framework and a microservices based component architecture, and the other one is a universal language for describing data processing and data structures. And both of those two things combined then meant you could think about problems in a different way. And so one of the when I think about agility from first principles, which is a big topic of mine, the ability to be agile actually is about adaptability. And to adapt, you've got to obviously do change. That means you've got to stop doing things and not worry about making things how robust things are. They should just be robust. You need to have flexibility and solve the problem with lots of solve different problems with the same skills. So I have not been successful in my career without Ab Initio, right? I owe everything the last 20 years to Ab Initio, but also the fundamentals of Ab Initio, thinking about things from first principles, is something I've always done, right? Because if you build something that's highly reusable, then it means that you don't need to go back and refactor that. And that's typically a problem, you having built data processing capabilities before, what you always end up doing is building frameworks, right? Things that generic processing that you then have configurations. If you don't do that, you end up having to rewrite your code. You end up having to spend your time doing that. And frankly, I'm lazy, right? I get bored rewriting the same thing over and over again. So I want to go and focus on other things. So Ab Initio helps me not be bored, right? Which is a very weird thing to say, but it's the ability to play and be immersed in data and to use it. And we have this lovely phrase, which is just know your data, right? If you don't know your data, you don't know your system, therefore you can't use it effectively. So I'm at Ab Initio. I kind of, it's difficult to describe what I do other than I am Jonathan, right? And I want to help people understand what Ab Initio does and how it works and why it was important to me. What I've learned. Just because I've learned something doesn't mean that's appropriate to others, but I can just share my experience and why I did things. Obviously there's the opportunity to talk to incredible organizations that are doing really profound things, right, and using data to deliver products and services at scale that's kind of hard to imagine. When you're dealing with the telco that's got several 100 million subscribers and dealing with millions of events a second, right, and helping them be efficient and drive good products and services for their customers is a really good thing. So I see myself as a catalyst, right? And I think of the things that we talked about before, what I want, and if you think about catalysts from physics, right, from chemistry, right, the role of a catalyst is to make a reaction better, right, and get more energy out of it. So as a human catalyst, my purpose in life is to help others be more effective, right? Is to help them understand systems, help them understand the data, help them be more productive in doing those things, and not be consumed by that process. right? That's a really important thing. I mean, it's quite a selfish thing that I want to be able to go and flitter around and talk to other things, but actually that act of being a catalyst is really important. It's helping people spark the interaction they didn't know about and to drive that value. So I'm right at the periphery of Ab Initio. I'm right on the edge. I'm on the boundary layer, talking to existing customers or new customers, or having conversations like this, trying to help people understand what their way of thinking, what they can do, and how they can solve problems in different ways. And that's where I spend my life.
Okay, well, thank you for this interesting answer. I really love this idea of being a catalyst. I think it's a great description. Yeah.
Well, let me. So that I just want to say why is that different from being a consultant, right? And that's an important thing. So I think that the purpose of a consultant is to always be needed, right? Essentially it's the same thing, right? And if your business is selling consultancy, then that's your purpose, right? You want to constantly being valued and to try things. Now, there's a challenge there that you can be constantly needed because you have skills that people don't have, right? And you give that advice, and you can do that by constantly increasing your own skills or making sure that the customer doesn't have those skills, right? And so therefore you're needed. For someone to provide consulting services, there has to be an imbalance of capability, and that's quite different, right? I actually want people to be better than me, right? That's the fundamental difference. Is to leave a lasting legacy, because I think for us as a species to be better, we all have to be better, right? And it's not just a few people. And it's not to say that the role of consultants are needed. There's always an opportunity for people with skills to come in and help drive change in different organizations. Absolutely. It's just that, I work for a company that sells software, and its job is to sell software, right? And I think my role is to help people understand how to use that software and to get the best value out of it when they use that software to interact with data and others, and to not be needed in there, right? Where I don't want people to say, oh, well, I always need Jonathan to help me solve that problem. It'd be a case of, oh, Jonathan, help inspire me understand how to solve that problem. That's my desire on that. So there's a subtle difference, right? And I think that subtlety is where I like to play.
Okay, thank you. So now putting all those things together, maybe your experiences at Sony PlayStation, data behavior, the insurance company, the startup, your general perspective on the market, being a catalyst, especially at Ab Initio, I think we can all agree upon the fact that you have a very broad perspective on the whole datascape, so to say, or on organizations using data or trying to use data in order to become better. The question is, do you see some general principles, or do you have general learnings that you may want to share with us that helps in being more efficient with using data, being more successful?
Yeah. So I just written down a couple of notes on here, right? So the one word that I always keep on coming back to is perspicacity, right? Right. You weren't expecting that. So perspicacity is a discerning, is a clarity of vision. It's an understanding what is the right thing, what's the right way of understanding a situation at a given moment, right? And the world is constantly changing. In fact, there's that phrase, isn't it? The only constant is change. So the ability to take an elevated view of any situation, not because you're trying to be superior, but you need to take what's the situation? What is the scenario? How do I understand this problem? Because problems exist because people don't understand what the situation is. And the challenge with complex things is that is it a complex system, or is it too complex for the people to understand at the moment, given their understanding, right? So part of this is the ability to move between abstractions. How do I abstract a problem higher up or lower down to get to the point of what do I need to do? And you do that by applying lenses or filters, right? I want to remove things, right? The art of solving a problem is not made, you solve problems by removing things, not by adding, right? And So how can I remove as much complexity to understand what is the real problem, right? And where are things going on? And you do that by really having this. So I build out my own book of patterns, right? Things that I kind of look at the world and go, that's this thing, right? Yep, whatever that 4-box model is, whatever that framework, and go, that's what that is. I'll move that out of the way. I understand that. This is the area I need to look at. Now, what's the next thing? How do I apply that? So there's an element of the management consultant in me, right, which is understanding a business and how it works. And if you think about that from first principles, customers, data, right? What is it customers are doing with that data? What is it customers do? What do they value? What's the data? What's the path from the customer to the data? And what's the path from the data to the customer? And understand those mappings. So I try to really simplify, ludicrously simplify any problem, because that's doing it from first principles, and then build that up. Where is the complexity? And it's normally as a result of cultural differences within an organization, right? You've had organizations that mergers and acquisitions, or they've got different departments, you've got different functions. It's usually the way that an organization has disorganized itself, right, to get there. So if you think about that, there's going to be data in different areas and different technologies, different standards, right? Different naming conventions. Like if you go to a big enterprise that's been around for 50, 60 years, they're going to have had computers for all of that time. They're going to have different requirements, right? If you think about good old DOS, you had a situation of 8 3, right? So 12 characters. So you had 8 characters for the first name and 8 characters for the file name, and then a suffix, right? And so you were constrained. There were byte constraints because resource was constrained. So that forced people to come up with naming conventions that then get enforced and stay over. I don't know if you remember. You're probably old enough to remember the old mobile phones, and the number of contacts you could have on your phone was limited, or the length of the name was limited. So, there are always constraints that have shaped the way that people design around those things, which then they compromise. So what you're trying to understand is how do you link those compromised decisions together to understand the better picture, right? Many times the issues with data are because you're using it for a purpose which it wasn't originally intended, right? You're dealing with the exhaust gas. So do you want to spend your time building pipelines to get access to data? Do you want to spend your time trying to figure out how to integrate some other technology to deal with this niche data structure you haven't seen before? Or do you actually want to be understanding how does this data relate to this other data so you can join it together, right? That's where you want to be able to spend your time. So for me, if I put my Ab Initio hat on, right, whether it's Ab Initio software, but more importantly, Ab Initio principles, it's what do I have to do so that I can really find the real problem to solve, right? What's the way of filtering out all the noise? So we dive into that. And there's a beautiful thing that as an outsider coming into a company, you get the chance to look at it in a way that other people don't. And I think the challenge of one of the challenges I think from COVID is this remote working, this remote interaction, that there's a lot of things that aren't obvious when you talk to someone electronically, right? Walking. It's one of the things I always used to love is walking around an office in a busy organization and seeing how people interact. There's spending a couple of weeks repeatedly walking the same route, you get to sense of the patterns and you get to sense of what's going on, and you can think, well, hang on, those two people are sitting together, why aren't they doing that? So there's a lot of skills that data skills aren't just about can I know SQL, or do I know a bit of Python, and can I implement a linear regression, right, or do a scatter plot and know Tableau or whatever it is, right, or all the other great things. A lot of those things around how do you maintain curiosity, and how do you combine curiosity with an ability to categorize and put sense in that? So Yes, I don't know if I've answered your question there, but shared a lot of the things that kind of important to me on that.
Yeah, it's definitely not the answers that I expected, but however, it is food for thought, so to say. It's really an interesting point. Thank you very much for this. But I want just to follow up on this question of experience, learnings, etc. I think you once mentioned that, especially when things go wrong, learning starts, or you see really you can learn something. Maybe you have examples.
Oh yeah,
From this perspective.
I remember many years ago, we were doing some processing, and I was working for a small company. Well, many mistakes that are made. I remember one where we'd misprocessed some data, and we basically had, it's like, this was early days, right? As a startup, do you have all your dev test prod environments? No, you were kind of doing hacking things, and kind of you cut corners. We'd loaded some data into our production database, and it was a very esoteric database technology. And I'm now imagining the situation. I'm just projecting my mind's eye back, and I'm sitting myself in front of the terminal there, right? These were the days when we had a green screen monitor, right? We didn't have Windows. You basically had four virtual screens you could switch between. That was all you had, right? And we'd processed the data wrong. It had gone into the database, and it got corrupted. And we basically had like millions of customer records. This was a real challenge, and it had gone wrong. And I had a couple of my colleagues around the corner. I had my boss and my boss's boss, and they were all sat over me, right, looking in as I was typing, right? And I knew the answer. I knew what I needed to do. I knew how we had to back the things out, and I'd made the notes. And they were just constantly asking these questions. I said, look, right, this is what we're going to have to do. You're going to have to just, leaning over me and looking at what I'm doing is not going to help, right? We're going to have to do this. But you also need to have kind of the rubber duck. You need to have the person there you can talk to and explain, right? There's, I don't know if you heard the phrase rubber ducking, right? Where the act of explaining a problem to somebody else helps you solve it, right? Because what you're actually doing is you're combining the left and right hemispheres of your brain, one that does depth and one that does breadth, right? I remember learning, this is way back, learning C coding, and there's a thing called fork and exec, which allows you to break and create sub-processes, right? It's a fundamental about how Unix works, right? The first process that runs, funnily enough, when a Unix box starts up, the first process is called init, right? For the initialization. It's no coincidence that ab initio is Latin. It means from the beginning. It's the very first thing, right? So that fork and exec is a fundamental process thing about Unix design. Now, if you get it wrong, bad things happen, as I discovered, right? And I coded it wrong, and basically I had this process that just recursively was just launching processes, and our box just stopped working, right? And the only option I had was to go into the data center and turn the box off and start and switch it on again, literally pull the plug from the mains. And it was fine, right? It cost me a little bit of time and embarrassment. I had to help my other colleagues as we'd broken things and fix it. And in the grand scheme of things, it didn't really matter. But what it did was it taught me I need to get that bit right and test that in a way that's safe. Do these incremental code and tests. But also I worry about, imagine someone doing that now on a really large, compute cluster in a cloud environment, and someone getting that wrong. Suddenly the costs are really high, right? That you actually physically, if you're renting your server from, Mr. Cloudy vendor, and you code a basic thing wrong, and then suddenly it's tens of thousands of dollars because of that mistake, right? I think there's You've got to learn when and how to make mistakes, right? And what's the right environment, and to check. I've got my favorite phrase, or one of my favorite phrases is, the rule of twos, which is don't start anything new 2 hours before you expect to stop work, right? Because you'll either, I've done it so many times, it's like, oh, I could just do this thing, and then I break the code and going, I cannot leave this code broken, because it'll not be working. I have to deal with it in the morning. I've got to fix it, or I get so drawn into the flow state of creativity that I suddenly, it's 9 o'clock at night, and my wife's going, "Why aren't you home? I've got to help with the kids." And I was like, "Yeah, but I was doing this really cool bit of coding." It's like that doesn't work, right? So it's having the self-discipline to take a step out at that moment. I think, there's those situations, but then there's also the kind of the inspirational moments. When we were at Sony, one of the things we were doing was measuring active users in an online game, right? So we had server logs, and we could see when people were logging in, and the sponsor of that particular service had said, okay, they want to measure active users. It was a really important thing for them to demonstrate their value. And one of my colleagues had written some SQL to do a report, and we had that, and it was great, right? And it was working. But because of the nature of the data and the system and the users of the game, that report that started out taking 10 minutes was taking at least 3 hours every day to run, right? And that 3 hours was, we could look at this thing, and it was basically hockey sticking. It was going to take longer to run each day than there was a day. And also it was just consuming resource on the box, right? Our server was running, and we couldn't do other things while that report was running. And so this was a problem to us. Now, the metric that the users, that the customer had said, or the internal stakeholder said, was they want to measure active users of people that have visited this online platform on 2 separate days in the last 60 days. Right? So effectively, the distinct number of days is greater than 2 or more in the last 60 days. And so this person had written some SQL, but what was also, they want to be able to show that as a trend over time. That was the thing. So it was this a massive Cartesian join that was going on. Anyway, so one morning I was having a shower, and I suddenly realized that 60 is very close to 64. Right? Yes, that's a number, right? But 64, of course, is what an integer 4 is, right? Sorry, an integer 8, right? It's 64 bits, it's 8 bytes. And what if I set a bit for each day the user is active? What if I treated that 64 as a mask, right? Because then I could just set a bit, and then what I can do is use bit manipulation to shift the register, shift the integer left or right. So if it's been a day, then I'll shift it right. If it's been a day, I'll shift it right, or whatever. And so we implemented this system, and we took the processing down from 3 hours to less than 2 minutes every day, right? By effectively implementing a bit mask and bit shifting. And my colleagues always said, "Oh God, John, you're always going on about bit shifting." And so for me, yes, absolutely getting to the heart of that. But what was great, of course, I implemented that in Ab Initio. It allowed me to go down to that low level, right? To code at the lowest level possible, and to really extract that CPU. Right now, for us, we were resource constrained. We only had one database we could run our queries on and to do our exploratory analytics. So there was a selfish need, right? I wanted to be able to play with the data, and I couldn't because this other report was going on. We also had a limited amount of resource, right? We only had one box we could do our data processing on. So if I wanted to do other things, that box was being used by that task. So for me, there was a very selfish need to do that, which was to create more time for me and the others to do things. There was also kind of the challenge, right? Can I solve this problem, right? Can we solve this problem that other people think isn't solvable, and solve it in a different way? So that was that was very, very satisfying, right? And what was even better is that I actually got somebody else to code it, right? That I explained the answer, knocked up a prototype, and then somebody else implemented it, and we got that working. And so, one of the lovely things about Ab Initio is that ability to focus on that right problem, that mindset of how do I solve things from first principle, but also from a software point of view, saying, this is what I need to do. I need to be able to, for an individual customer, I need to identify the number of days since we've last seen them and implement it. Now, actually, how do we then actually solve that problem? Well, let's just say it's in the last 64 days. I'm not going to worry about applying a bit mask at the end. But effectively, I can look at that number. If that number is greater than 0, then at least one bit must be set, right? Because it means that a customer must have done something in the last 60 days. Well, is that number a power of 2? If the number's a power of 2, then only one bit is set. So the trick now is to say if the number's greater than 0 and it's not a power of 2, then the user is active. And then, and I can't remember offhand, but there's an algorithm for looking at an integer and seeing whether it's a power of 2. I mean, you could do another one, which is count the number of bits, but actually it turns out that computationally that was a more efficient way of doing things. And over the years, I've always looked at how I can do low-level bit manipulation, all kinds of problems. In fact, I'm kind of looking at a solution, looking for a problem every time on there. Now, that's orders of magnitude performance improvement, right? And that was important to us then when we had an enabling constraint for things. I really worry about the use of cloud now, and I worry about people's inability to do those things, right? When you're dealing with software as a service that doesn't allow you to go beneath the covers and understand how to manipulate things, then your ability to solve a problem is constrained to whatever that service provides you, right? And I think I've got a little note here I keep with me, that software as a service is anti-systemic, right? It breaks up the system. A true system is one that you can move between abstractions and get at it. The purpose of software as a service is to stop someone transcending to a lower level. And so I can't imagine it would be as easy for someone to solve that problem I had in the way that I solved it now. They might just go, oh, well, we'll just run a load more servers and solve that. Right, that would be the approach. Oh, but then you just look at the horrendous costs. It's not just the monetary costs; there's the environmental costs. Yes, great. There may be some cloudy databases that allow you to shard and have multiple instances, and people do things so that, I'm running a terrible query, but Gero doesn't need to worry about it because he's got a virtualized instance of that database. But what that actually means is that I'm consuming the company's resource, right, to do that. I'm spending CPU and electricity that we don't need to, right? And we have precious little of those things, right? We think about the environmental impact. Efficiency of code, efficiency of operation has to be the thing that survives. We think about all the stuff we talked about here, right? Yeah. It's not just, oh, can I solve this problem? It's, can I solve this problem in an efficient and effective way that doesn't do lasting damage, right? And I think that's a really important thing. And so it's very easy to think about attacking a problem and adding more and more and more. But the real art of this is how you can reduce and strip things away to say what's the basic things that you can do, and the ability to do that. And that's a thing that I kind of love and I'm really passionate about and helping others do.
Okay, thank you again. This was again very, very interesting. Many interesting aspects. I really love this rule of 2. I think it makes sense for almost everything. We are a little bit running out of time, so I have 2 last questions now. Maybe you can keep the answers a little bit shorter.
Yep.
The first one is, I think we once talked about critical thinking. I think we always are talking about critical thinking, but related to data literacy. And I thought that this is a very interesting connection that you made. it's obvious when you talk about it, but it maybe not so obvious when you haven't thought about it. So maybe you can make this connection again.
Yep. So, I mean, hopefully, the last hour, right, everything we talked about is about critical thinking, right?
Definitely.
What is the right thing? And I think it's allowing you as an individual to not to step away from the problem and think about what is the real problem, right? So I think the illusion that people have is that to be better with data means you need to have better technical skills, right? Do I know Python? Do I know this algorithm? Do I know this library function? Do I know, Rust or Go or Java or, SQL or this weird thing in Excel? Well, of course, those things are useful, right? Those are. But if you can't be critical of the problem, then your ability to understand it is going to be lacking. Remember, analytics about context, and if you can't think about context, then you can't solve that problem. So I think the foundations of data literacy, actually, I think we shouldn't be talking about data. We should be talking about systemic optimization, right? Because data only exists to help you understand what a problem is and what's the right way to measure and solve it. And if you focus only on that, then you're not thinking about how you're going to solve the problems. And if you think about how do I as an individual be more valuable to an organization, right? Being better with data, well, yeah, that's great, right? But understanding what are the problems, what are the questions that people aren't asking. If you understand the system and you think about, well, this is the system, this is how it works, people are asking this, but they're not asking that. So I think about all the areas where I've added value over the last 30 years, where things that I've done to be creative, it's playing in that void, playing in the empty space, playing in the areas where people aren't thinking, and being brave enough to go into those areas, right? So for me at Sony, I wanted to understand the data from a customer's perspective and to deal with that. So for me, critical thinking is a foundational thing, right? And it's, if you get drawn into, oh, I'm going to learn all aspects of SQL or Python or whatever, then you're not allowing yourself, you're not putting yourself in a position to understand those things. So I would suggest doing, I read lots of books, right? And I'm very fortunate in that situation. I've had time to that. But I think understanding economics and sociology and, how people behave and, what are our biases, how decisions are made, right? What does system design work? As many different things as possible, other than pure this. And the other thing which is really important in large organizations, data transformation, yes, literacy is important, but you've got to understand, right, what's the other, how does the business work, what is its purpose, and how does it interact? And just saying, when you go into a situation and every department calls the rest of the company the business, right? You're in finance then treat the outside world as the business. Marketing, we're marketing.
Yeah.
I've got Jane and Sarah and Rudolph and whatever in my team. Everybody else is the business, right? And what you'll find is that you have this weird thing that unless you move between departments, you don't actually realize that everyone calls everybody else the business, right? And so how do they interact? How do they talk? A business has to be this cohesion of everyone working together, right? So for me, get the purpose of getting good with data is so that you have time to do other things. That's the most important thing, and how you spend that time is important. Building those relationships, talking to other people, being curious, understanding the world. Because there's the sad truth is that not all creative things are valuable. Right? If you think that there's only two ways to add value to a business, you can either reduce cost or increase sales. Reducing cost is very easy, right? It's a very good short-term thing. I'm going to stop this function. I'm going to get rid of this department. I'm going to lay off these people. I'm going to outsource this activity. it's very easy. I mean, the actual decision, as a manager, having to sack someone is a horrible experience, right? But from a business perspective, it's a dehumanizing thing, and going, our job is to make money for our shareholders. We're going to reduce our costs. You as a manager, you need to reduce your costs, right? It's a dehumanizing thing. But it guarantees a short-term return on that investment, right? That you've done a thing. Whereas the creative process is a much more long-term one. It requires faith. It's a belief that people who are creative create value, and not everything they do is a valuable thing, right? It might be that only 1 in 10. It's very unlikely, you get those unicorn situations where you're going to create like the $1 billion company with 5 people or whatever. It might be that it's 1 in 20 opportunities. It's like the footballer that only decides to shoot when he thinks it's the perfect moment. You've got to shoot all the time. You've got to, the job is to hit a goal, and sometimes you miss, and you just pick yourself up and go again. And so I think that that thing about critical thinking, which is your original question, and you said to keep it short, and I haven't, right? But that thing about critical thinking is, and why that's more important than literacy is, yes, the literacy is the foundations, but it's more than that, right? You've got to think more. And I'd say system thinking is the goal, right? Is to think about the system and understand the system, and then how do you make that system better?
Yeah. I think this even sounds like kind of a summary of our whole talk today. The system thinking, critical thinking, addressing really the problems, understanding the problems, asking questions that haven't been asked. And so far, I'm very happy that you answered this question again with some more words. That's fine for me. Thank you very much. So we come to the last question. We always try to have at least one question looking into the future. So the question basically is, do you see any important trends, developments in our area? Well, the area is quite broad now. It's about data, it's about systematic thinking, it's about agile organization, but maybe you have some trends or developments in the future that you want to share with us.
Yeah, so I would say that, I'm very fortunate that I get to talk to many organizations, and the pattern that I see emerging is a shift of emphasis of thinking about metadata as an asset, right? So metadata is data about data, and you've got different forms of metadata, right? It's not, it's a suitcase word. Suitcase words are ones that you have to unpack to understand, right? And I think that's a lovely phrase, right? But essentially, you've got technical metadata that allows you to describe your systems, what your data looks like, physically where it's located, what the structures are, what the fields, what the business rules are. But then you've got more kind of business related metadata, things about your hierarchies, your ontologies, your languages, right? And the what is PII, right? What's personal identifiable information, and how does that relate to the technical data? Now, I think that most of the effort that people and organizations are doing is in the weeds. It's very low level, right? And what I've found, I had this down, is the need for higher geared organizations, right? For people to be higher geared, to get a higher return on their investment, to be more agile and more effective. And that can only happen if you're driving your data processing from your metadata. When I think about, people talk about data mesh and data fabric. These are emerging trends, right? We know, right? We've been in the industry long enough that there'll be another trend, another thing in 2 or 3 years' time, and people will stop doing that. We had data lakes for a while, and now we've got data lake houses, and then we've got, moved that onto cloud, and then there's always going to be something new. And yet the fundamentals are, I need to know my data, I know my shape of data, and drive that. And what I think is really interesting is organizations that have a metadata team. But I've seen a couple of financial institutions that are saying they're going to create a metadata team. They're going to create an asset and treat metadata as an asset. And when you think about an asset, the purpose of that is you're going to make an investment in that I'm then going to get a return on that investment. I'm going to use that metadata for as many different purposes as possible to drive value. And I think that's a really interesting area, right? I think because that then changes the way that people think about using data. So instead of hundreds of people, because we talk about the literacy, right? We talk about the demand for talent, and there's a deep irony. Like, we want to have AI, people saying AI, got to have these, but why is artificial intelligence creating a demand for more and more people? That doesn't seem right to me, right? That all these organizations all saying we're going to have to do AI, and yet having more people who where they're all going to come from, right? Where are all these skills come from? Why aren't we reusing the skills we've got and the people we've got? So I think stop handwriting code and create frameworks for data processing that use metadata to drive them. And then the real challenge is, how do I connect my technical to my business? That's the real challenge. And of course, I'd say, my Ab Initio hat on, we've got answers around that. But I think it's got to start with people thinking that that's the right way to go, and not just have 2,000 people handcrafting data pipelines. That's just not a manageable situation, right? It might be good if you want to have the ego of saying, I've got 2,000 people working for me, and believe me, there are companies like that. But the reality is that you've got to go that. So I would say that more than anything else is the most important thing, is that connection between technical and business metadata. Some people call it a knowledge graph, but the knowledge graph is just a knowledge graph doesn't imply the use of that data. So I kind of think about that intersection is the real thing, right? Is building out that catalog and using it to drive processing.
Well, thank you very, very much, because I really love this answer, because it's exactly what we believe in, that metadata is so useful, and you can do so many things if you really understand metadata as something valuable, as an asset. Yeah. So it's the perfect point, I think, to end our talk at this.
Fantastic.
With this answer. Thank you very much, Jonathan. It was really a pleasure talking to you. Also, I was always surprised by the answers, and I've got so many more questions. Nevertheless, I hope we find the chance to ask you these questions. I think it was a great opportunity to learn from your experience. Thank you for sharing all these inputs openly with us. And many thanks to all participants today. Thanks for taking the time, and hope to see you again next time at our series Data Heroes. Bye-bye.
Excellent. Thank you.